Hey everyone, welcome to Secure AF, the podcast about all things cybersecurity. I'm your host, Teddy Underkoffler. Today I'm joined with co-host Donovan Farrow.
Welcome back, humans.
As well as our special guest for the episode, Jonathan Kimmitt.
Hello, all.
So today we are going to be talking about vendor due diligence. But before we get into that, Jonathan, if you wouldn't mind, tell us a bit about yourself and kind of your career and everything that you have.
Well, thank you, Teddy. I'm CISO here at Alias. Before that, I was CISO for a private institution up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, University of Tulsa. And through my career, I've done a lot of privacy, a lot of compliance, and a lot of that has to do with our vendors. You know, as we have moved into cloud infrastructures, as we've moved into off-premise services, a lot of things that we have to think about nowadays is where our data is and what services we're using and how those affect our vendors. Well, the modern infrastructure now is in the cloud. And that's not something that we otherwise ever thought about 20 years ago. You know, if we have data sitting in a server somewhere, I know where it's at. It's downstairs. Mm-hmm. And so coming up through the ranks at the university, you know, I started as help desk supervisor, joined the computer security response team, and kind of built my career from there, and eventually became CISO. And I've had the very fortunate career path of having a lot of different pieces of IT, whether it was front-end support, client services, infrastructure, networking. All those fell under me at some point in my career. And that's really helped me on the CISO side to understand all the requirements that we have in terms of seeing the compliance out there for the requirements, so whether it be NIST or HIPAA or CMMC or any one of those, and then turn around and go, okay, what do we need to do in our organizations to meet those requirements? Well, when everything went cloud 10 years ago, it's like, okay, well, I don't control that server anymore. Well, now I have to go talk to someone else to make sure that they're meeting my requirements for this compliance. So, about 7 or 8 years ago, I started really getting into the vendor management. I teach classes at conferences for vendor management for IT. I've probably 400 or 500 contracts that I've had to review and modify and give to our general counsel and pass on to the client.
Sounds very exciting.
Yeah.
Very exciting.
I really enjoy it.
and I'll let you run as well, but I just wanted to point out, as I always talk to the listeners all the time, is if you guys didn't hear that, he said he started in help desks. I know a lot of people kind of push that away and, you know, think that's just not maybe too good for the help desk. I came from a help desk myself. It's very important. And as he worked through his career, everyone wants to know, Donovan, how to get in cybersecurity, all that stuff. It's good to start, quote, I'll use the world's words, is at the bottom, because you get to touch everything.
Absolutely.
You know, fixing computers, Outlook, we're still trying to fix that every day of our life. Going all the way up server, network, admin, you have way more exposure and your skill set just expands. I just wanted to commend you for that. That's a good background. I think people just don't come through the ranks like that as much as they should.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, the biggest benefit I had from the help desk, and I'll tell you, I think the best security people actually come from help desk, because security deals with people. And when you're at the help desk, you're working with people. You're working on their desktops, they're working, you know, on their services, their email, helping them get back up and running. And that's what we do in security, is we work with people, working with problems, incident response, contract management, all these different things. But you're ultimately working with people. And I think really help desk is a good starting point for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing in the industry, I'm not getting super off topic, but just pointing it out, we're not taught a lot of soft skills. And I tell people, even just for running my own business, a few of those, is you could have the cure for cancer, but if you don't know how to communicate, no one cares.
Absolutely.
So it's definitely something to kind of think about as you continue to grow in cybersecurity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great thing. And that's something that successful people in this industry are great at, going out and talking with people and interacting with people, because you got to ask questions. You don't know what's going on, ask a question. If you need to interact with a vendor, you got to ask questions. If you don't know how to ask those questions, you're not going to be able to do the job.
Right. And I guess going back to the 300 to 400 contracts, let you kick off for that. I'm just kind of curious, because that is a lot. I mean, that's pretty, very overwhelming for me, just out of the gate, considering for vendor due diligence. Like, what is the most common mistake or something to look for in that, since you've been exposed to that much? What exactly are you firstly looking for?
Liability. That is the first thing when you're dealing with any contract of any vendor of any kind. You look at where the liabilities are. There's a certain amount of liability management that deals with any vendor management. And it also depends on the vendor, because you've got 3 or 4 different kinds of vendors. You have a vendor that might provide a software to you. So you download it, you run it, you do whatever. You have a vendor that might provide you services. So there's a software as a service or infrastructure as a service. There's a vendor that you are giving data to. So they're going to get data and they're going to process it. Or a vendor that's going to be in your environment. They're going to be on your server floor. They're going to be, on your computer. So you've got different kinds of vendors. But liability is really important. Who is going to be liable in case there's a problem? If there is a breach, if there's an incident, if there's a theft, who is going to be liable for that? And I think a lot of times what people want to do is minimize their own liability, for sure.
Yeah.
Vendors are going to do the exact same thing. They're going to minimize their liability. But now we have compliances out there that are stopping that. They're saying, no. You can't minimize your liability. You have the same liabilities as the controller, as the business. And you have to meet those same requirements in terms of security, in terms of controls, in terms of the compliance of those variety of things. So as an example, at the university, every one of our vendors, except for ones that just gave us a product, they had to put in writing that they understood that we dealt with FERPA data.
Gotcha. Yeah.
If they didn't understand that, I didn't do business with them.
Right.
If they say, well, we want your data, but we don't want any FERPA data. Well,
okay.
Our data is FERPA data.
Yeah.
So,
Or another reply to weeding out vendors is, I don't know what FERPA is. That might be another key point. We don't know it. No, we don't do that.
Yes, exactly. In fact, in my checklist, I have a checklist I go through on every contract, and it says in there, FERPA, HIPAA, all these different ones that I was, in compliance with. And I looked in the contract; those words had to be there. If there was not words in there, then we had a data writer that we put on there saying we are compliant with FERPA, or we have to be compliant with FERPA or HIPAA or whatever, just so that I made sure that they understood that.
Nice. Yeah, liability. I'm not surprised by that one. I think it is changing, and I not that I like compliance, but I understand it needs to be there. And it's
Sure.
What I'll say is that it has bringing everything back in, because everyone just not every CISO, but I've seen a lot of CISOs or CISO, however you say it, make everything not their problem. So I'm going to outsource everything top to bottom because I'm not going to be liable for anything. And when I choose big company that has a big name and they mess up, they're on the stock exchange. What else did you want me to do? They just try to pick down top to bottom just to push liability. So, which is a great strategy, I guess, for a long-term corporate person. But for me, that was being facetious, by the way. But it doesn't. I think having that ownership, and it actually makes them care more, because it is their job to protect the company and the property data. And I like how it shifted. It's been better for just organizations in general for security.
Yeah, absolutely. The whole shifting of liability of putting it on that big company, that software as a service or infrastructure as a service, it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
It's just a reality. It doesn't work. And what I really liked is when GDPR really came out, there was a whole rash of new terminology that came out with it. One of them is controller and processor.
Wait, I have to be that guy. What is GDPR?
The General Data Protection Regulation out of the EU. It's not quite the granddaddy of privacy compliances, but it's the big one. It's got the most news in terms of the world when it came out. Now, in the U.S., we have secretarial privacy compliances. We have HIPAA for healthcare. We have FERPA for education. We have GLBA for financial institutions. So we have a variety of compliances in different industries. But GDPR did it different. They did one for everything. But what came out of that is this idea of controller and processor. And what I like about that terminology is me, as the institution, I am the controller of this data or these services or this, intellectual property, whatever.
Yeah.
Everybody else is a processor. So that liability for me as the controller sits with the name. I control it. Everybody else is a processor. They do what I need them to do in the contract or the services they're providing me. So that has made a shift in the thinking that people have in their organizations, because now they are the controllers. I think it's a mental shift, because now it's thinking, okay, even though I'm giving you the data or I'm putting my data on your service, I still control it. I'm still supposed to control it. And when I don't, then I get in trouble. And I think that's why the shift is happening, is because a lot of these compliance, all the new privacy compliances that were after GDPR, all the state compliances, all the country compliances around the world, they have that same concept. Who is the controller? Who is the processor? And it's very clear rules in what you have to follow. The processor doesn't get to make decisions on the data. That's the controller.
Interesting. Yeah, I knew that it had changed quite a bit, but I didn't know it was actually quite the snap back. I think where it should be with the controller.
Absolutely.
People just losing track of data. It just, I think for so long, just the liability shift has been nuts.
Yeah.
Kind of going through contracts and stuff. One thing about vendor due diligence, this is just my 2 cents, and I always tell everyone, is have you seen, or you probably would recommend, the data breach clause? And like, if I have a breach X, have you seen that?
Oh, yes.
Like, what would you recommend? Can you kind of, dial in on that? I think I'd be interested to hear on that.
So there's actually a couple of things nowadays that when you're doing a contract and you're dealing with a data incident or a data breach. So for higher education, they have 24 hours to report to the DOE that a controller had a suspected breach.
Wow.
So a suspected breach, not even confirmed. They think they had something. They have 24 hours from the moment they heard about it to report it to the DOE. And there's a lot of compliances out there that have that same requirement. So if I have a vendor who has my data, I make sure that in the contract there is various pieces, but one of them is that they understand that I have 24 hours to report the breach. Therefore, they have 24 hours to report the breach to me so I can get to the DOE. Now, they don't like that.
Yeah.
They absolutely hate that.
Because my question is, okay, 24 hours from what? From you knowing, or?
So for the DOE, it's 24 hours from me knowing.
Got it.
But I put in the contract that they reported to me within 24 hours of them knowing.
Love it.
Yeah.
That's nice.
They hate it.
I bet they do. So my next question would be how do you classify, I guess I want to say the word incident, and is that nomenclature in your vendor due diligence broken down as well?
Yes. So that was one of the things I look for in every contract. I have this checklist that I go through, and one of them is the definition of a breach. I ask, there's several different things I asked for. Number one, what is the definition of data, PII, sensitive PII, a variety of things.
Yeah.
And usually I want them to reference a particular compliance so that compliance will define what is that PII, not me, that complies. Then I ask them for a specific process of what is a data breach. So how do they define it? And then I make sure that they match what I define as a data breach. And that is generally unauthorized access to data. Now, that's really unauthorized access to data does not necessarily mean data was stolen.
Yep.
It does not necessarily mean data was accessed. It was if they had access to that data. So if someone got root level access to a server, maybe they did not actually look at the data, but they could have.
Right.
That is a definition that I have used in the past, is unauthorized access to data.
And that would be classified as a data breach?
That would be
very technical, the words here. I'm just
I
legally
call
is over
that
here.
An incident.
Okay.
And the reason why is I don't like using the word breach. That is a legal term.
Yes,
and
it
that
is.
particular term requires certain things.
Mm-hmm.
So I call it data incident. However, in my contracts, I do make sure that they have a definition of what is a breach, because I need to know that, because in some cases, their definition of breach is so out there that nothing will ever get to you.
Right. That's a bad word. The B word in litigation, breach,
Yeah.
incident, event.
Yes.
It's also a great term for people to use during that. So something to kind of be aware of. Yeah, nice. Liability. What else do you see would be kind of common for that for vendor due diligence? Definitely liability. I guess also maybe risk on defining contracts. I like the nomenclature thing. That was interesting. What's another thing we could kind of drill into?
A lot of it comes down to security controls and making sure that they have otherwise deployed security controls. And that's what a lot of compliances require nowadays. If I have to have certain amount of controls on my data or my services, so do they. MFA is a perfect example.
Okay.
So if I have to deploy multi-factor authentication across the board to cover everything that I'm doing, then I need to make sure all of my vendors or processors also have to deploy multi-factor. And you can do that a couple different ways. You can just put in there, one of the things that I do in my data writers is I put in there that they must deploy industry standard security controls. Now, the old way of doing it was commercially reasonable security controls.
Okay.
And I don't like that.
Sounds like smoke and mirrors. Go on.
Industry standard security controls. If I were to ask you, so Donovan, if I were to ask you what's the definition of industry standard, how would you determine if something is industry standard? This is not a trick question.
I mean, I feel like, you might be asking the wrong person here. Industry standard, interesting. So I would think it'd be something that is commonly known as a security feature that can exist. I would say MFA, password policy. Not everyone can walk into your data center and have some type of access control.
Yes.
I would say kind of the commonly known issues, but I don't know who is in charge of industry standards.
That's a good question.
It was a setup. I felt it.
And
It was a trick question.
I present that is because there is no formal definition of industry standard. Now, commercially reasonable is an accounting term. It's an accounting audit thing.
Okay.
But industry standard is what I like to put in the contracts. The reason is this. Something happens. Vendor has an incident. We find out they have not deployed MFA.
Yeah.
That's what caused the incident. They are liable. All these other things. Let's say we have to go to court.
Yikes.
I go to court. They go to court because harm was caused to me. I want to go to a judge and have him make them do something.
Yeah.
I'm going to stand up and say, Your Honor, what they were doing was not industry standard. And I fully expect that their lawyer is going to stand up and say, well, there is no definition of industry standard. And I'm going to say, Your Honor, you're absolutely right. So what I would recommend is that you, Judge, such and such, go call 10 CISOs out in the world and ask them whether or not these controls they deployed is considered industry standard. Do you know what that judge is going to do? The judge is going to go, I'm going to go call. So he's going to break. He's going to go back into chambers and he's going to go make a few phone calls. I know this because I have been called.
Wow.
Nice.
And so when we're talking about these definitions, some of the liability that we have to do as institutions, as organizations, is think about what position we're going to be in if there's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a public view, the court view, law enforcement view. So when I say industry standard, I'm very prepared to go to a judge and say, Your Honor, I am not going to try to define that. But you could go and ask 10 CISOs out in the world, any of them you want to do, and ask them, is this industry standard? Because what is industry standard? Well, it's the standard in the industry. It's common words, common vernacular.
Yeah.
So if he or she goes and calls and they go, yeah, MFA is standard. Okay.
Wow. That's awesome.
Just getting kind of confirmation from your peers, essentially.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Absolutely. And we do that in a lot of things. Like GLBA has designated qualified individual. What does that mean?
Oh, wait, what is GLBA, sir?
It's the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, which is one of the privacy compliances that financial institutions and other institutions have to abide by. But one of their new guidelines that they have presented here recently in the last year or so is that every organization has to have a designated qualified individual or responsible for security.
I do like that qualified. I think we discussed that.
Yeah.
If you could dig in that just real quick, talking about vendor due diligence, and how that liability is still with the owner of the business. Can we talk about kind of how that world works?
For the designated qualified?
Yes.
Yes. So it's very much like the industry standard. If I have to go to a judge and I tell a judge, sir, this person was not qualified. Well, how do you define qualifications? Like, Your Honor, go contact 10 CISOs out there in the world and say, this person's skill set, were they qualified to be doing the job as a CISO or a security officer or whatever they were going to do?
Yeah. And I heard a few stories about that before it was specifically defined. And this is just their, quote, qualified person went to someone who was, we'll say, I don't know, someone who was the cleaning person or someone who was the mail person. And that was their, quote, person that was in charge of that. And that's when this kind of got stirred up, was that they're not qualified.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with those positions, just probably shouldn't be in charge of the security for a company.
Right. I mean, the definition of a security officer or a data protection officer or a CISO, especially as it relates to compliances nowadays, that there's an expectation that this person reports to the board, reports to the highest level of management. And maybe they don't report in terms of the supervisor and such, but they have to provide reports. So if this person, the best example I have is I was working with an organization a couple of years ago now, and they called me in because they were doing a cybersecurity cybersecurity insurance application. I went in, I was helping them, and I was reading through the application just to make sure everything was good.
Yeah.
And I saw in there, because it has, I think the line says, who is your named security officer or CISO or whatever it said. And they said, yes. You have a security officer? Why am I here then? And they go, well, we have a network engineer that's pretty good in security. So that's what we figured they meant. No,
Sweet.
that's not.
Did you let him know this? Does he know?
Right.
Yeah.
He might ask for a pay raise as well.
Right. They had a few others that was questionable on that application.
Yeah.
But the idea of compliances dictating that you need to have a designated qualified individual is coming around because people weren't doing it. They weren't actually getting a qualified security person to be in that organization, whether it's an employed person or a VCSO or anything like that. They don't have that expertise, and just picking somebody out of the blue saying you're CISO now.
Wait, so what you're telling me is people were going through these audits and like not telling the truth, or just answering randomly, or
I'm not saying they were lying.
Right. We would never say that.
They misunderstood the question.
Oh, got it. And that's yeah, that makes sense. So they'd go through this and say, yes, we have MFA on every door here, and my car, MFA everywhere. We have all the MFA.
Absolutely.
We actually run a group called the MFAs. So that's what we do here. That makes sense. That's good.
Yeah. It happens a lot.
So I'm kind of curious. You had mentioned in your intro that you started out at help desk and then eventually came up to CISO. And just now you mentioned, qualified individuals you would tend to assume would be the CISOs.
Mm-hmm.
How do people actually determine who would be the qualified individual? What is that? I mean, if the qualified should be a CISO and maybe an institution doesn't have a CISO.
I go back to ask 10 other CISOs.
Okay.
And there's a lot of argument about certifications versus training versus experience and, all of that. I don't want to get into that argument because I find it brain numbing at this point.
It's a different episode.
Yeah, exactly. But what I would say is this: an institution generally should not determine on their own whether or not someone is qualified or not. That's a dangerous thing because they themselves may not be qualified to make that decision.
To determine who is qualified.
Right.
Yeah.
But if they were to go out and ask 10 other CISOs, I know I'm bringing that back up, but if you go and ask other CISOs like, hey, is this person qualified? Now, if you go ask one CISO, that's their opinion. You go ask 3 CISOs, it's like, okay, I'm getting a pretty good idea. You ask 10 CISOs and they go, okay, I've got kind of this minimal level of they need to have this experience, maybe this training, maybe this certifications. That's how I help people do it. And I have been called in many times Working at a university, I was called in to be on hiring committees, because they were needing to have a security person, and they didn't have anybody in their organization that could do that job, and they didn't know what to ask. They didn't know the questions to ask. So I'd come in and I would help them. So those sorts of things I think is really important, because an organization may not know what that qualified means, but there are resources out there that you can go and ask questions. And, you could bring in, vCISO services to understand, what does this mean? What are the services this person can actually provide me, so that when they go and look for someone full time, or maybe not, maybe they just use that, because designated qualified individual does not necessarily mean employee. It just means that person is now designated in their organization to be the person responsible for reporting cybersecurity issues to the highest level of management.
So it could be a vCISO, somebody you contract with.
Absolutely.
It doesn't have to be a full-time hire.
Absolutely. There was nothing in there that I have seen and that anybody's ever talked about that person has to be an employee of the organization. It has to be designated, has to be qualified, and it has to be a person.
Yeah.
If you can hit those pieces...
Sorry, AI, nice try.
Well, ChatGPT, other words, I don't know. But, that's all they care about is, do you have somebody who's got the experience to help you navigate cybersecurity nowadays? Because it's hard. 15 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe you could get away with having a handful of people that knew a little bit about security doing stuff in an organization. You can't do that nowadays.
Yeah.
You really need to have a set of skills, and maybe that's with an individual if you're a small organization. Maybe it's a team because you have a large organization, because you don't want to kill your CISO, just only man of hours. You have to look at what are the needs of the organization, what are the needs of that CISO to provide back to that organization.
Yeah, and that's pretty interesting. I didn't really think at it from that angle. I've had many clients, around 5 or 6, bring me in because they were hiring a security team, and they were like, man, I don't know what to ask them.
Yeah.
I can talk if they have a good attitude and going to fit in the culture, but I don't know what security questions to ask.
Yeah.
And that was actually, they were very grateful for that. It was quite a few. And that makes sense to me, because I guess I could be that third party, or it was in that case, the security expert, fingers quotes,
Right.
To kind of help present them and lead them in the direction, say, this person's good at this,
Yep.
you choose, which is the best opportunity. I love, here's what I have to say about these 3, but this is your decision.
Right.
So
Right.
let me know. I can help.
Right.
So that's really interesting. Kind of going back to the vendor due diligence, kind of just running back to that. Is there any, I'm sure there's more topics. Is there another top level one you want to talk about when kind of reviewing, when you have a vendor, any other big things you also see?
So the big thing that I push really hard for organizations to do is actually get information from the vendor of what they do. So what do they do in terms of their security? What do they do in
Wait, can we restart that?
I was just going to glide right past that.
Fucking
Well,
robot.
gotta restart that one. Yeah.
Piece of shit.
Okay, you're going to have to ask the question again, because now my brain is on the
No,
Do I
you're good.
Do I clap or what?
Here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So kind of going back to the vendor due diligence, kind of not so much a list, but I would like to know if there's any high level point that you'd like to share. We've already had a few topics, but there's got to be another point that you want to share that can be kind of dialed down for the vendor due diligence from the client.
Right. Vendor management. This is the key issue. You are working with a vendor. You are gathering information about that vendor. You're understanding what that vendor does, how much liability they're going to take on, what's their cyber insurance, what are the skill sets, what are their controls they're deploying. You have to document all this. Many, many times I want it in the MSA, the Master Service Agreement. Sometimes I need to have a data writer that describes some of this stuff. I'm going to ask for documentation. Maybe they have a SOC 2 report. The HECVAT, which is for higher education, is a higher education community vendor assessment tool, which is 400 questions asking the vendor, do you have a CISO? Do you do training? Do you have MFA? Do you do this? Do you have encryption? Just on down this line. I ask the vendors to provide that information to me, because I have to do due diligence to make sure that the vendor is going to be doing the right thing. I can't make the vendor do it. That's one of the interesting things. A couple of years ago, I was in an organization. I was walking through vendor management with them, and one of the IT professionals saying, "Well, I want to pen test the vendor."
Sweet.
What? Yeah, that's not going to happen.
No.
There's no vendor that's going to let you pen test them.
Yeah.
And number one, the person wasn't qualified to do the pen test, but he was very adamant about that because he wanted to make sure that vendor was safe. To an extent, there's only so much you can do.
Yeah.
But what I do for the organizations is I say, okay, if you're my vendor, I need you to provide me all this information because I need to make a determination on whether or not you're going to keep my data safe or provide this service in a safe way. My job as the controller is to keep all that documentation. So I keep the reports, I keep all emails, I keep all contracts, I keep everything to make sure that I've got it all in writing. If they have something, there's a lot of times the vendors say, well, that's on our website. Well, I asked them to print it off their website and put it in the MSA.
As a vendor, I can speak to the truth of that from other companies. It is super exhausting.
It is. Absolutely it is. And I don't mean it to be, but I have to protect my organization.
And vice versa. I mean, if you're buying a service, like I need to know your car warranty, how many miles we got on the tires, when's the last time you change your oil? All that is important. So that's
Absolutely.
I do like printing it off the website though. Did you make them like send it like first class mail, like sign, or I want to know? They were like, sure, Kimmitt, I got you, fam, and went and printed it and put it in like the gigantic manila envelope and made you sign for it. That's what I would have done.
And I'd be okay with that actually.
Or like on like those big plastic checks.
Yeah,
maybe
if they want to be passive aggressive like that, I am okay with that as long as I get my information.
they would have
Get what
earned
you
my
needed.
business for 3. I changed my term to a 1 to a 3 year immediately.
And getting that information. So the reason why I want that is because if there's a problem later, I need to go reference that. I need to go back to it. And when they say, hey, we have it on our website, go take a look here. Okay, but you can change that website anytime.
It's true.
I don't have any control over that.
Yeah.
So if they refuse to do it, and I've had some vendors that will do that, then what I do is I document it. I print it off of the website and I document it when I download it. I have a process that I do for that just because I'm paranoid and OCD about it. I download it, I document it, and I store it with my vendor file, my vendor management process, to whatever you do in your organization. Now, there are times you may not necessarily want that information in the contract. So I may just ask the vendor, hey, do you do this thing? Do you deploy MFA across the board? Do you encrypt, at rest and in transit? And what are they going to say, especially before the sale? Yes,
We do all of that.
absolutely.
Absolutely, we do.
Absolutely.
And then not here for the record. But people will be like, hey man, we had an MFA on everything, right? If we don't, can we do that? And then after everything's done, then they go back and check the yes box.
And I'm okay with that as long as they get it done.
Yes.
Before my data touches their servers, as long as it's done, I'm fine with it.
Yeah.
But I want that documented.
Mhm.
And sometimes I don't want it in the contract because there are some things that are as beneficial to me in case there's a problem later. Now, I don't want to, necessarily provide all that information on this because it's not the right forum and such.
Yep.
But there's a lot of benefits there. And vendor management can get really complicated. And vendor management is a cooperation in the organization between IT security, IT, risk, and general counsel. Those people have to work together in the vendor management program in the organization to make sure you're getting all the pieces you care about and protecting the data and protecting the services for your customers.
So I've got kind of a simple question.
Okay.
What do you define as a vendor?
Anybody that's not me.
Okay. So, because I'm just thinking about it, right? It's anybody who's going to have kind of like your data information, correct?
It's beyond that, but yes, those
Like a
would be
basic.
included. So it's anybody who is not an employee of the organization, and it is not that person or that entity is not bound by the rules and regulations of that organization.
Okay.
They are a vendor of some kind. This vendor may be a no-fee vendor. You're not actually paying for anything. However, they are still a vendor. They should still go through your vendor management process because they are an entity that's not you, but you are now responsible for what they have done with your data, with your services, with your customers.
So if that's the definition of a vendor, then some of these larger companies and enterprises have an
Thousands.
unbelievable amount of them.
Yeah. So I was in a panel about a year ago now. And it was a great panel. We were going around the room and everybody was eating. We were having a good time. And we had a gentleman who was in the back, and he was telling us that he was in the middle of his company was in the middle of a merger. So it was two large companies merging together. He was processing, I think I remember, 40 different vendors a day.
Oh my goodness.
And you could tell it was wearing on him.
Yeah.
So the panel, which was, I think there was 4 of us there, we donated all of the, of course, as a panel member, sometimes they give you stuff, and I think it was all alcohol in this particular one. And so we gave all that to him.
Yeah, he said, you need this more than us.
Yes. But yeah, they do a lot of vendors. When I said 300, 400, 500 contracts, that's not a lot of contracts. In my contracts class, we go through 12 contracts in that 8 hours. I make them read 12 different contracts and review them because the only way to really get used to doing contracts is to do contracts. So you're going to do a lot of contracts. There are times I might have 10 contracts that are actively working. I'm engaging with the organization or with the vendor. I'm engaging with the department. I'm engaging with this. I'm going through the MSA. I'm redlining. I'm giving it to general counsel so they can redline their part. It's a lot. I've got one person who has come to 3 of my vendor management classes at the conference. And it's kind of a joke now that he every time I do this, he comes. But he says, every time I come to your class, the first year I hadn't done anything. Then I started seeing this. I started actively engaging in contract management. I wanted to come back and go, okay, now that I've got a year's under my belt, now really get into it. And now he comes back because, it's fun and we have a good time in the class. But he always picks up something new in the class. And of course, I change it every year to stay up to date. I had somebody stop me at the last big conference last fall. I was running to my room to do my presentation because I didn't know where it was at. And he literally grabs my arm and spins me around. And I was like, oh, hi. I didn't even remember his name. You. Yeah. It's like, hey, how are you doing, buddy? He goes, just FYI, I loved your class. I haven't seen you since we've done the class, but I had such and such company, very large company, as I redlined their contract just to see if they would do it. They accepted my red lines.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's like, that's great.
That's fantastic.
If you don't ask, it's true. So it's like, oh, that's great. I talked to a few minutes and I ran to my class or ran to my presentation so I could do it. But those sorts of things, people don't know that they can do until they go and learn it or until they have someone experience them. But once you start into it, then everything, it's like, oh, we've got this volunteer coming in to work on this project. What's the contract for them? What services are they providing? What access are they going to have? How do we control that? When do they leave? Who's responsible for that? Are they getting data? Are they getting an organizational laptop? All these things you got to think about, because if you don't, then something bad happens, an incident happens, and then I get called as incident manager or incident commander. Yeah. And I say, okay, where's the contract at? I can tell you this. Thanks. Very early on in my career as CISO, we had a vendor incident. And it was a fairly involved incident. And the first thing I did is like, where's the contract? And the department's like, we don't know. It's like, okay. It's like, well, we need to find it, so please look for it. We ended up having to ask the vendor for the executed contract.
Oh, no.
After they have had the incident. the vendor knew they were probably going to have legal action against them. And we had to go ahead and ask them for a copy of the executed contract.
So you could know what legal action you could take against them.
Oof. So the department and I had a very long conversation about how we were going to do things a little different and do things a little bit better. And when I mean a little bit, I mean a lot better.
Substantial changes.
Yes. Unfortunately, that was, again, very early on, that dove me, head in all the way into vendor management at that organization because, no one was doing it. We had an incident. It hurt us. We actually had to do notifications out to people. It wasn't big, but it was still significant. I mean, it was something that we had to deal with.
Yeah.
And those sorts of things that you don't think about it until you do. My philosophy is, okay, this happened. Let's fix it. Let's clean up. Let's recover. Let's do whatever. And let's make it better for the next time. And I can almost guarantee you that from that point forward, there was a copy of it, the MSAs of everything that I managed because I kept a copy.
Right.
General counsel kept a copy. Purchasing kept a copy. We had a copy of an executed contract.
Nice.
We had some old ones we were still working on, but those were the types of things that if we touched it, of course, I'm OCD, so all my checklists, all my notes, everything goes into that vendor file because 6 months later, I have to go back and go, okay, what did I do? And when you're doing, let's say 300 contracts,
yeah,
you don't remember them. You can't. You're not going to remember the details. Good notes, good checklist, good process, and that's what's going to help you in your due diligence when dealing with vendors. Now, the reality is this. Vendor management doesn't count until you have a problem because you don't think about it. You don't think about, okay, well, what's going to happen when there is a problem until there's a problem. Now, my advice, do tabletops, get expertise in to help you. Have somebody come in and do a tabletop just on vendor management. That way you can go, oh yeah, we don't have that. When I do a tabletop on vendor management, I ask for a list of all the vendors they have. And I go, okay, Kerchunk, this is the person we're doing today in our tabletop. I need the MSA. I need this. Here's the scenario. And they've got to, in the tabletop, they have to go get the MSA. They have to go get all the paperwork. They have to go get the emails. They had to get the vendor manager, whoever, whatever the department is, bring them in. We have to discuss. We have to talk. I'm going to ask them questions on what data is going to this vendor. And my hope is they have a sheet of paper somewhere or a PDF or whatever it says, here's all the fields we send them. And this is why.
No, that's great. I love how it ties in so many different departments.
Oh, yeah.
Especially from the CISO side, like what you're in charge of. I think people miss that vendor management due diligence in that. And then once you start opening, you realize how many, you said what, accounting,
oh yeah,
purchasing,
yes,
legal.
Yeah.
And even if it's a vendor for HR, so now HR is involved, whether it's payroll and how far does that go and social security numbers and just a lot.
Vendor management, it's a institutional issue. It's not an IT issue. It's not a CISO issue. It's a organizational issue. Now, CISO generally is the person that is either part of or managing your incident response team, especially as it relates to data security and privacy and such. So it behooves that CISO to be very involved. And when I say very involved, not only do they know this whole process, but they should also be reading every contract. Every contract should be, if you have a privacy officer, that's great. The CISO should work with that privacy officer, should work with that general counsel.
Right.
I had great general counsels where I was at. I had two, and they were great to work with. I loved working with both of them. Both of them wouldn't even look at a contract until it had come to my office. It could be that the CFO took it to them. They said, nope, that's got to go to Jonathan.
Yeah, he's going to red line this. It's a waste of our time. Send it to him first.
Yeah. They didn't want to have to think about any of the IT security or data privacy stuff. Now, they'll do all the legalese. They'll do everything we need on that.
Yeah.
But if it deals with the data security or the IT security or even IT, they don't know that. They don't know the questions to ask. So they send it to me. I would redline it and I'd send it back, and it made their job easier. So one of the very first things I do in my class is I tell people is what we're going to learn here is going to make your general counsel's life better, you're going to be best friends with them. And that's what I intend to do, is make it to where we have the CISO or IT security, they have a say in it. They actually have input. They provide value. But there's a reliance there that general counsel needs to rely on that CISO, rely on that IT security to help them protect the organization.
So I'm kind of curious. Earlier in the episode, we had a lot of conversation about compliance, HIPAA, GLP. I'm imagining a lot of people who would be these qualified folks who are in charge of vendor due diligence. I imagine that falls heavily on making sure that you are compliant for all of these compliance as well.
Oh, absolutely. It is a requirement. I mean, when you're dealing with any of these compliances, there is a segment in there usually spelled out that your sub-processors or your processors, depending on the terminology they use, is going to meet the same requirements you do. And as it relates to HIPAA, for example, HIPAA has some very clear language that you've got to have a business associates agreement. If you're going to be using a third party to do something, you have to have a clear agreement that they understand that they will be dealing with HIPAA data, what they're going to be doing with HIPAA data, how they're going to handle that HIPAA data, how they're going to notify you if there's an issue with the HIPAA data, or how they're going to ask you questions about the use of that HIPAA data. And that's all in the business associates agreement, CMMC. So it's for the DoD, the government requirements or cybersecurity maturity certification. That is specifically if I am getting controlled, unclassified information from the government, which is what CMMC is all about. If I'm getting that data and I have to hand it to a vendor, I have to be CMMC certified. I have to make sure that they are CMMC certified and that they understand that their subprocessor is CMMC certified. So all these requirements go along there. And if I, as the vendor manager or the person who's otherwise managing this project or the compliance, I have to make sure of that. I've got to be a jerk sometimes when I say, okay, well, I had a contract once, GDPR. We talked about GDPR earlier, but we have GDPR in scope people. And one of the requirements on GDPR is that a processor cannot make a decision on data. They have to get approval from the controller. So me as the organization, it's my data. I give it to a processor to do something. Then if they want to give it to a subcontractor, they have to get my permission. Now, the reality is it's not only they have to get my permission, I have to let the data subject, the person whose data it is, I had to let them know that this subprocessor is handing it to this other subprocessor and why they're going to use it and do whatever. So there's a whole big process. It's not that I get to decide as an organization. I have to let the data subject know. But it's very clear lines. So when that subprocessor says, I think we're going to move from AWS to Azure. Well, they're moving my data subject over to another vendor. They, by GDPR, are supposed to get my permission to do that. Well, in a contract, they don't want to do that. They'll have it in the vendor agreement saying, you will accept all of our subprocessors. No, I won't.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I will redline that and I'll say, no, I will accept your current subprocessors as long as they meet these requirements. So please give me a list. But any new subprocessor, I want them to ask me before they send my data there. And when I say me, I'm talking about me as the organization.
Yeah.
I don't want them to just decide to take my data and hand it off to someone else without me knowing it, because that's what gets you into trouble, because that third, fourth, or fifth subprocessor is the one that gets compromised. I hear about it on the news. It hasn't worked its way up to let me know about it. And maybe their agreement says, well, they don't have to tell anybody. Right. So that's a real problem. So my requirements and my contracts are they can't give my data to someone else. And if they do, I have to approve it. And that subprocessor or subprocessor has to meet the same security requirements, regular compliance requirements that I do in my organization.
Do you get a lot of pushback from that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I have been screamed at by contract people. I was actually on a call just before I came to this job. The last couple of days, I was on a call with a contract guy or a lawyer, and he was yelling at me over the phone, telling me that I didn't know anything about contracts, that I was not a lawyer, and it was all about cyber insurance, by the way. I was requiring them to have X amount of money in terms of liability.
Yeah.
Now, my advice is for them to have cybersecurity insurance to cover that liability. They did not want to do that. Okay. But you still need to have this coverage. So if it's coming out of your budget, oh, fine, whatever.
Yeah.
And he was yelling at me saying that no one ever does that. That's unacceptable. They're not going to have. But my requirement was simple. If they cause an incident, and let's say it turns into a breach,
Right.
I want them responsible for all the cost that is incurred by me and my customers or my data subjects,
Right.
because they caused it. They didn't want to take that liability. And they understood that liability was huge. But my job is to protect our data and to protect our people and protect our organization.
Right.
So I honestly didn't care that he didn't want to do it. We ultimately decided to go to a different vendor.
Imagine that.
He just,
Wouldn't do it.
Now, one little snippet, you get into this stuff, and usually you're dealing with an organization, and they will negotiate. They'll say, oh, yeah, we can do that, or no, we can't do that. And there's a compromise there.
Right.
This is the world.
Yeah.
Come to find out, I found this the day later. This lawyer actually originally wrote this contract 2 years before for this organization. He was an outside firm.
Yeah.
He was emotionally attached to this actual document because he wrote it, and he was very angry that some random CISO was saying, no, I'm not going to let you do this.
Your baby's ugly,
wow.
by the way.
Exactly.
That's hilarious.
So sometimes they will get very emotional. One of the things you have to think about in terms of your organization is, so me as CISO, I need to be that objective opinion. I can't be the one who's negotiating a lot of this stuff. So the department wants the vendor. I need to come in and go, okay, what are you doing? What are you providing? Let's meet in the middle and let's get the contract. But there are times I've had to tell the department that we can't do that. It's like this person is this entity is too much of a risk. And it's for a variety of reasons, but that relationship that I had with the organization, with general counsel, with leadership, with our compliance officer, that is critical, because there were times that I call it pulling the CISO card. I had to just say, no, this is too much of a risk.
Yeah.
And I had to make sure that my relationships with leadership and with general counsel was strong enough that they would come back and go, Jonathan says no, we trust this. We're not going to do this. Let's go find an alternative. Because there's going to be times that the department really, really wants it.
Yeah.
It's their friend, or it's sales guys. I love sales guys. We've got some great sales guys here. But on the other side, they're not my friend. I'm the CISO. They're selling a product to one of my departments. I need to be that objective opinion saying, okay, is this legitimate? Can they really do what they say they're going to do? There were times that I found in the contract they just lied. It's not their fault, but what was written in there was a lie.
Wow.
And when I asked the question, then they went back and they changed the contracts. But if no one else had gone in there and looked at that may have gotten through.
Yeah. Crazy.
No, that's so interesting. I mean, it sounds like from everything we've talked about, vendor due diligence initially sounds like such a simple concept, but it is anything but that.
There's a lot to it. And I encourage people to spend time. If you're not the type of person that reads the Apple terms of use, or if you're not willing to sit down and read every bit of that, or the Google terms of use, or any of those, contracts may not be your thing.
It's a no from me, dog. Thank you. And we'll continue this long story with Kimmitt's 16-hour breakdown of vendor due diligence coming up soon.
No, that's perfect. Was there anything else about vendor due diligence that maybe Donovan and myself didn't ask you about that you wanted to talk about today?
So I've got 36 things I want to cover.
Within reason.
No, I'll tell you this. The reason why I like vendor management and the reason why I like compliance and I get into contracts is ultimately our goal is to protect people. And that is a process that we use to protect their data and sometimes to protect people, in terms of life safety systems and such. So I think it's really important. And I encourage all organizations to spend that time to really review those contracts, review those vendor agreements, review those vendor relationships, because it's not just the agreement, it's the interaction with those individuals that's critically important, especially when there's a problem. So all of that comes down to being good stewards of people, protecting your people, and having the right mindset and going in and doing the job of security and privacy.
Nice. Well said.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's all I have for today's episode. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. Donovan, thanks for co-hosting.
Glad to be here again.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Want more Secure AF? Find us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever else you find your podcasts. We publish episodes every other Thursday, and if you're interested in watching a full video of the podcast, you can find that on our YouTube or on secureafpodcast.com.